recording.
Okay, well, we're gonna go ahead and pick up where we were at last week, and I'll just do a little review. The Bohemian lands were settled originally by a tribe known as the Boii, B-O-I-I, Boii, and so Bohemian. Point St. Wenceslas was crowned at 14 and 921. And he was martyred by his brother Boleslav in 929 because he was trying to convert people to Christianity. And of course, he's St. Wenceslas of the Christmas Carol. Bohemian crown is known as the crown of St. Wenceslas, where the crown of Hungary is known as the crown of St. Michael. And we'll get into that next week.
Stephen,
excuse me, you're right. St. Stephen. In the 15th century, the Hussite movement would be started by Jan Hus, and this was an early Reformation. And I finally was able to do some more reading about this and get a little clearer in my head exactly what they were trying to do. One of the things at that time the Hussites believed very much in is that when you take communion, that all participants get both the bread and the wine. And that was a departure from the church at that time, whereby only the priest partook of both the bread and the wine. And so that became a very strong kind of sticking point with the Hussites, and they practiced a different form of the Eucharist than the Church of Rome. At the end of the Hussite revolt, the church had lost 4/5 of its property in Bohemia to the nobles, and these were nobles who were both Hussites and Catholics. So not all the church property went to just the Hussite nobles. So interestingly enough, there actually became a set of circumstances where Bohemia had a Hussite king. Sigmundsson was Holy Roman Emperor, and that was he was a king of all sorts of places. I mean, he was a king of Sigmundsson was a king of Poland. He was Holy Roman Emperor. He was king of I believe he was king of Hungary. He was the husband of Maria, who was the sister of Jagwita, who was the Polish queen who married Jagiella and started that dynasty. So this is the time period we're talking about. Anyway, Sigmundsson inherited the Bohemian crown when Wenceslas died in 1419. And he was returning to Hungary in 1437 when he died in Moravia. Sigmundsson's death vacated many crowns. So like I said, history holds many secrets. So entered Albrecht of the Habsburg family, and he was Sigmundsson's son-in-law, and he ruled Bohemia from 1437 to 1439, and then he passed away unexpectedly, and he left a pregnant wife. And his wife had a son who was named Ladislav. And so he was, he was a baby, obviously, when he's born, and he was the rightful heir to the Habsburg crowns. And so because he was a baby, the Bohemian lands were ruled by Landfrieds and a jury of Podbrady, which is an Eastern Bohemian Landfried, basically ruled the country while this child was growing up. And he was a strict adherent to the Compacta, which was the document that laid out the Hussite beliefs. But he feared the Utraquists were becoming too accommodating to the Church of Rome. And so he seized the city of Prague in 1448 to control the church and the government. In 1452, he was elected to governor, and he was actually voted for by some of the Catholic nobles. And he was able to subdue the Taborites, who were the real fanatic Hussites. In 1453, Ladislav reached the age of 13, and so he was able to assume the role of king, albeit still a minor. And so he would have a regent who looked over him, and that was Yuri in this case. In 1457, Ladislav died, so he was only 17 years old when he died. And at this time, the Bohemian electors, this is the nobles in Bohemia, had given up the succession of Charles the Fourth and decided that they were going to elect their own king. And so on March 2nd of 1458, the Bohemian electors selected Yuri of Podbrady as the king of Bohemia. His coronation was not accepted by all nobles of the crown of Wenceslaus. Again, you had a split between Hussite nobles and Catholic nobles, and the Catholic nobles were not at all happy about making Yuri their king. However, Yuri was he was a pretty good politician and whatnot, and he had daughters. And if you had daughters, I think spatially back then, and you were a ruling king, daughters were good to help gain favors from other royal families. So he did a pretty good job of marrying off his daughters. But in 1466, Pope Pius II excommunicated Yuri and declared him deposed from the throne. Yuri's son-in-law, so this is somebody he married one of his daughters off to, Matthias Corvin, who was the king of Hungary, decided that he was going to head an anti-Hussite crusade. So he moved from Hungary across Moravia in 1468, and he basically conquered Moravia and the city of Olomouc, and the Catholic nobles in Moravia elected him as king. So now we have the so-called Bohemian crown lands with two kings. And so war, basically have real war kind of breaks out, and they fought on and off until March of 1471, when Jury passed away. And prior to his death, he'd urged the noble electors of Bohemia to select a Jagiellon from Poland to be the new Bohemian king. So in July of 1471, the electors selected Władysław Jagiellon as their new king. And he had to continue to fight Matthias Corbin for the overall crown. And the two of them battled back and forth with stalemate. And they finally ended their armed conflict with a compromise. And so Władysław would be the king of Bohemia, and Matthias Corbin would continue to rule Moravia. Władysław then went on to work to heal the rift between Bohemia and the Pope. To help to do this, he replaced the Hussite town councilors with Catholic ones. And this resulted in a revolt where the councilors that he'd put in were actually murdered by the Hussites, and they in turn replaced the councilors with people they chose themselves. And because of this rebellion, Władysław stayed in Poland for over a year and kind of waited for the whole thing to settle down. In March of 1485, there was a diet of Kutna Hora, and they passed legislation which basically required tolerance between the Catholics and the Utraquist. And this was an attempt to try to stop armed conflict. The coalition supporting Prague in 1483 was the last of the great religious leagues that crossed both social and political boundaries. I think that after this period of time in history of Europe, at least, the ruling houses stayed out of trying to do both social things and political things. And they just stuck with the political. During the 15th century, the Gothic period was transitioning into the Renaissance. European society was expanding with the discovery of new lands and expanding foreign trade. I found this to be a very interesting concept in this one book I read, that Europe at the 15th century really, view of the world, it was greatly expanded because all the peripheral countries were involved in exploration. So the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Italians, they were all out exploring, finding new worlds and developing trade routes to the east. So this is also during the period of time in the 15th century where all these countries in Eastern Europe were facing a threat of the spreading Ottoman Empire. And Bohemia also faced a whole series of weak leaders, weak kings, we should say, and more powerful nobles. And so the balance between the executive and the legislature tilted towards the legislators. In 1526, the Habsburg family's rule came under Ferdinand I. He really worked to restore strong central rule. He of course, he was a Catholic, and because he was the Holy Roman Emperor, he was basically forced to accept the Hussite Church in Bohemia, and he went on crusade in 1546 against the Protestants in Germany, and many Czechs at this time revolted against the Habsburg rule, and so their revolt failed, and as a result, Ferdinand had many of the prominent Czech Protestants executed. And after this, he invited the Jesuits to Prague and other communities in Bohemia to basically to convert the Hussites back to the Catholic faith. So after the war, the Habsburgs had a lot of power, and the Czechs had virtually no power. And Bohemia was totally absorbed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ferdinand was king of Hungary. He was the king of Austria, and he was king of Bohemia. In 1556, Charles V was the Holy Roman Empire, and he abdicated his rule due to poor health, and that's when Ferdinand became the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles's son Philip inherited the title to Spain and its possessions in the New World. So at this point in time, in the early to mid 16th century, the Habsburgs basically controlled pretty much all of Eastern Europe, and they controlled Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. So their power and reach was really widespread in Europe at that time.
Yeah, come on in.
In 1564, Ferdinand's son Maximilian succeeded him as king of Bohemia and Hungary, and as a Holy Roman Emperor. This is when Ferdinand had passed, and Maximilian was not as he wasn't as stringent a Catholic, nor was he a determined politician in terms of the fact that he was not trying to grow his empire, and he wasn't trying to force his religion on everybody around him. About this time, the Utraquists, the Lutherans, and the Brethren came together in Bohemia, and they accepted a common statement of faith in 1575. Maximilian was succeeded by his oldest son Rudolph as king of Hungary and Bohemia and Austria, and as Holy Roman Emperor. Rudolph was well educated. He was very cultured, but he tended to be mentally unstable. In 1583, he moved his seat of power from Vienna to Prague, and he basically turned Prague into a cultural center. Of note, he attracted the Dutch astronomer Tycho de Broglie and his pupil Johannes Kepler. He also attracted a lot of astrologers. Apparently, Rudolph was into big into astrology. He also attracted alchemists, and he also attracted just a lot of plain charlatans that were, people that had cons and whatnot. At this period of history, we have the movement to humanism and the Renaissance, and it found its way into Bohemian life. Education gained in importance as reading, writing, and doing sums was now recognized to be important in the transaction of business and commerce. Bohemian schools were non-Catholic schools. However, the Jesuits founded a school in 1556 in Prague, the Clementium, and they also founded schools in 1566 in Olmach and in 1578 in Brno. At this time, architecture was flourishing with the use of a lot of Italian designers, and they came in and remodeled a lot of old Gothic style buildings in Prague, and they basically updated them by putting new facades on the buildings to change their appearance, to make them look more modern. And the style of construction at that period of time became known as Mannerism, and it basically foreshadowed the later Baroque style. And if you're into the study of architecture at all, Baroque became a style of architecture that had an awful lot of frills and adornment to it. So from 1598 to 1603, supporters of Trident Catholicism held control of the government in the Bohemia and Moravia, and they were threatening actions against non-Catholics. The opposing states, these were the Hussite nobles, used this conflict to extract a letter of majesty affirming the right of religious freedom to nobles, burghers, and to peasants from King Rudolph. Rudolph issued this letter, and he knew that his brother Matthias opposed him doing it, but he did it anyway. And his hope was that literally days after he issued the letter, he would have it undone. So Rudolph knew that he had problems with basically with his brother Matthias. So he turned to his cousin Leopold for the use of his army. And Leopold was the bishop of Passau, and Leopold's army came and pillaged Prague. And upon arriving in Prague, they pillaged the lesser city, and it provoked the nobles so much that they sided with Matthias, and because of all this, Rudolph ended up resigning his crown to his brother Matthias. Of course, usually when we see one of these rulers resigning their crown, they pass away shortly thereafter. So Matthias becomes Holy Roman Emperor upon his death in 1611. So at this point of time, we have really the last great religious war in Europe, and the first continental-wide conflict taking place, and that's the 30-Year War. And the 30-Year War is basically 4 different wars. The first one is the Bohemian Palatine War, and it lasted from 1618 to 1623. And that was really a fight over who controlled Bohemia, the Hussites or the Catholics. And then the Danish got involved, and they were involved for about 4 years, and they were basically trying to gain influence and territory. And then the Swedish entered the war, and they were, both the Danes and the Swedes were in it because they were trying to protect Lutheranism and the Protestants. And again, they were trying to expand their reach and territory. And then the last part of the war was the Franco-Swedish part of the war. And this is when the Swedish army went after the Habsburg family in Spain. So the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30-Year War, and it established the framework for international relations that still exists today. It further strengthened the Habsburgs' control of its parts. It also settled the independence of the Netherlands from Habsburg Spain. I think a lot of us forget that the Netherlands was really part of the Spanish Empire for several centuries. So this is when the Netherlands became independent. And at this time, Switzerland also was given its independence from the Holy Roman Empire. And France and Sweden emerged at this time as major powers, and the Habsburgs' position was weakened because of the emergence of France and Sweden. But while their overall power was weakened, their hold within their own realm was increased. So the treaty confirmed that who rules determines the religion to be followed. And that was the real outfall of the Peace of Westphalia. In 1620, the Czech Protestants were defeated at the Battle of Billahora. This is White Mountain. And as a result of this, the Protestant nobles' property was seized, and much of it was given to the Catholic Church and or Catholic nobles. In 1627, a new Bohemian constitution was imposed, limiting the power of the Czech Diet, and it established Roman Catholicism as a religion of state for Bohemia. So this ends a period of over 200 years of, I guess you call it, religious dualism in Bohemia. During the 30-Year War, the Czechs suffered terribly. In 1632, the Protestant Saxons took over Bohemia, but they were repulsed by Catholic forces. For the next 13 years, both sides fought back and forth over the Bohemian lands. With the end of the war in 1648, Bohemia was devastated and its population was substantially reduced. Protestant landowners had their lands seized, and land was, a lot of it was given to German Catholics. A quarter of the free population fled to other Protestant or more tolerant states. So, you know, you really have a depopulation occur as a result of the 30-Year War. During the war, peasants' rights surfaced, and in June of 1680, Emperor Leopold reaffirmed the robata of 3 weeks, or 3 days a week work required for the lord of the land. And the patent was reaffirmed in 1713, 1717, and 1738. So the peasants in Chad region revolted from 1692 to 1695. And they sent their appeal to Vienna, but they were crushed for their effort when their leader was executed, and others were sentenced to hard labor. Again, what they were trying to do is appeal for something other than hard labor. So after the 30-year war ended, a period of time entered which is known as the time of darkness in Bohemia. And this would basically occur and be considered the period of darkness from the time of the Treaty of Westphalia to when Maria Theresa and her son Joseph II became Habsburg monarchs. So after the defeat, many leaders were executed, and many intellectual and cultural leaders went into exile, depriving Bohemia of both cultural leadership and its identity. So from 1620 on, the Catholic leadership of Bohemia was absolute and unquestionable. Conversion was desired and almost required. I found this kind of interesting. Confession was required weekly, and it was recorded, and it was shared with the Habsburg authorities. So, confession wasn't just something that was between you and your priest. It actually became a matter of record for the Habsburg authorities. Educational institutions came under the control of the church, both at the elementary and university levels. Rural schools were almost always taught by the parish priest. And so he served a dual role as both religious leader in his community and parish, as well as elementary school teacher. So Maria Theresa came to rule in 1740 as a Habsburg monarch. She was the first female monarch for Bohemia since Lebus, who was a legendary 8th century queen of Bohemia. And I couldn't find anything about her other than she was legendary queen of 8th century Bohemia. So obviously she was a queen before really any recorded history. So 2 months after Charles the Sixth's death in 1740, Prussia invaded and gained control of Silesia, and this was part of the Bohemian crown land that had been part of Bohemia since John of Luxembourg's rule in 1320 AD. So this was a period of 400 years that Silesia had been part of Bohemia. By the end of 1741, Prague was occupied by combined armies of France and Bavaria, and Charles Albert of Bavaria had himself proclaimed king of Bohemia. He was able to get some of the nobles to swear allegiance to his rule. So again, here we have this Prussian that's come in and claimed the throne. Maria Theresa was, again, in 1741, she was fairly young. So she regrouped with her advisors and everything, and she solicited the aid of the Hungarian estates. And in 1742, she ended up having to surrender most of Silesia to Frederick of Breslau. And this is the Frederick that is known as Frederick the Great. With her army, she was able to drive the French and the Bavarians out of Bohemia. And at May of 1743, she had herself crowned as the ruler of Bohemia at St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague. More conflicts led to the unexpected of Charles Albert of Bavaria in 1745, and it's followed by his son's renunciation of his claims that he had made, such as being the king of Bohemia. After 3 more years of conflict, there was an agreement that was made at Aix-la-Chapelle to end the war of what was known as the War of Austrian Succession. And of course, this is the idea here is that you had these other powers of Prussia and Bavaria that were trying to challenge the legitimacy of Maria Theresa's rule. So at this point in time, we have a period that's known as the 7-Year War. And this is from 1756 to 1763. And this is also known as the Third Silesian War. Prussia attacked Saxony, and then it overran the northern half of Bohemia and besieged Prague again. The Austrian army then defeated the Prussians in June of 57, ending the siege of Prague. Frederick the Great then invades Moravia, and the Austrian army again defeats him. And then the Habsburgs and the French and Russians form an alliance against the Prussians, and they basically hand Frederick's Prussian army repeated defeats. And the coalition started to fall apart in 1762 when Tsarina Elizabeth died and the French lost ground in North America. So if you'll note the date here, 1756 to 1763, this is the time that the French-Indian War was taking place in northern US and Canada. And so when Elizabeth of Russia dies, the French are losing ground in North America, the British. And at this time, Maria Theresa just admits that Silesia is lost to Prussia for good. And they signed a Treaty of Paris in Hubertusville, recognizing the loss of Silesia. Winston Churchill, years later, would, in his analysis of history, would recognize that this 7-Year War was actually the first World War that was fought. So this is a war that took place in both Europe and North America. So after the 7-Year War, Bohemia basically just entered a period of time where it was just part of the Habsburg Empire. There really wasn't much of anything notable going on. Bohemia was becoming a leading textile manufacturing area, but it still relied on agriculture for much of its export income. Maria Theresa and Joseph II were very instrumental in many reforms. They decentralized some aspects of government. However, they did increase the absolute power of the monarchy. The idea that they had evolved to is that the monarch was a representative of the people of their domain, and they should, as thus, behave and plan their actions accordingly. The advent of the 19th century brought about, of course, all the fallout of the French Revolution. In April 20th of 1792, France declared war on the King of Bohemia and Hungary. That's Leopold II. Leopold, he passed away, and Francis, his son, was in the process of becoming the head of the Holy Roman Empire. So Francis would end up taking part in 3 anti-French coalitions. And these were 1792 to 1797, 1799 to 1801, and again in 1805. So we're starting up the 19th century here. November 1905, Napoleon's army occupied Vienna. Napoleon then defeats the combined Austrian and Russian armies near Brno on December 2nd of 1805. And the Treaty of Pressburg requires Austria to accept French hegemony in Italy and along the Rhine. On August 6th, Francis resigns as Holy Roman Emperor, and this is basically the end of the Holy Roman Empire when he resigns. So it's part of some of the concessions that Napoleon extracted out of the Habsburg family. Napoleon then crushes the Prussian army. In 1809, Austria will ally with Spain, and they attempt to stir up the Germans to support them against the war against Napoleon. And this leads to their defeat at Wagram and the Treaty of Schönbrunn, where Austria confirms the subordination to France. And this is when Count Metternich is appointed, and he manages to arrange a marriage alliance with Napoleon, where Napoleon weds Francis's daughter, and after he divorced his wife. And so we now have an alliance between France and Austria. In 1812, Austria was drug into Napoleon's ill thought out invasion of Russia. The Austrian troops accompanied the French army, but they avoided engaging the Russian forces. As Napoleon's troops failed on the Russian conflict, Austria took the opportunity to join Britain, Prussia, and Russia to engage Napoleon at the Battle of Nations at Leipzig in October of 1813. And the coalition troops basically entered Paris as Napoleon was abdicating on April 1814. And of course, then he went off to Elba, and unfortunately, he didn't stay. So the four allies, while disagreeing on the details of post-war structure of Europe, came together after Napoleon escaped from Elba. He returned to France and decided to challenge the Allies once more with the French army. And of course, this is when he was defeated at Waterloo in Belgium in June 15th of 1815. In 1848, Europe once again was in revolt. The Austrian Habsburg king promised his subjects some constitutional changes, and in June, a Slav Congress was held in Prague, and the Czech radicals erected a barricade around Prague, and the army withdrew. This is the Austrian army withdrew from Prague, but then they bombarded Prague with artillery until it surrendered. Soon after this revolution, the Habsburg Empire basically collapsed. So at that point in time, Hungary basically sues Austria for independence, and they become two independent countries, Austria and Hungary, under one monarch. So what we're finding at this period in the 19th century, the Austrian army is no longer a dominant army, and they suffer literally one defeat after another. So they're defeated in 1859 by the French, and then they're defeated by the Prussians in 1866. And that's what basically, led the Hungarians to say, we want to separate from Austria and be done with all these military defeats and having to continue to fund Austrian adventurism. So again, there's not much politically going on in Bohemia, but Bohemia continues to industrialize. And in the 19th century, coal mining became a big industry, and textile manufacturing continued to flourish in Bohemia. So in 1914, the Czechs reluctantly enter World War I with the Austrians and the Hungarian. Their reluctance was especially true on the Eastern Front. They did not want to fight fellow Slavs in Russia, and many Czechs surrendered to the Russians to avoid fighting. At this point in time, university lecturer Thomas Masaryk formed the Czech Committee abroad in Paris. His group changed its name to the Czech National Committee. And in November of 1915, the organization became a call for independence for both Bohemia and Slovakia. In June of 1918, the committee was recognized by France as the provisional government of Czechoslovakia, and then by Britain and the US later on in 1918. And in October, they were recognized as independent by Italy. Thomas Masaryk gave President Wilson a copy of the Czechoslovakian Declaration of Independence on October 14th of 1918. And independent Czechoslovakia was declared in Prague of October 28th, 1918. At war's end, Czechoslovakia was the only industrial state in Eastern Europe, and it also provided the only democratic state under Masaryk as his first president. And he had 4 terms and resigned in 1935. after he had a stroke and was in his 80s and in very poor health. During this period of time, Czechoslovakia produced some great writers, Franz Kafka. The other prominent writers were Jaroslav Hasek and Karel Čapek, who was the first person to use the term robot, mechanical man. And his mechanical man was in a play called RUR, Rossum's.
You've reached 304-422-5605. Please leave your name and phone number, and we will get back.
The interwar period problems in Bohemia were the significance of a German minority who basically lived kind of along the northern edge of Bohemia. And the detente troops were actually sent to this area, and they made sure that the Germans understood that they were part of Czechoslovakia. So this is in 1918. So we'll go ahead and take our break now. And then after the break, we'll continue with the start of the Second World War. So see you back in 10 minutes. So the depression, economic depression that started in the US spread to Europe, and it especially affected Czechoslovakia since it was a highly industrialized country, and it reduced their industrial output. By 1934, it had fallen to 60% of what it had been prior to the Depression. So they basically lost 40% of their industrial production, and a third of the workforce had been laid off at that period of time. In 1935, the economy of Czechoslovakia started to slowly improve. However, the minority problem in Bohemia just continued to fester. And during this period of time, the Sudeten German Party was formed, and it rapidly gained popularity with the minority German voters. Henlein, the founder of the party, really was a close ally of Hitler's, and he started to demand that the Sudeten Germans have equal footing with both the Czechs and the Slovaks. So he saw a country where there were three co-equals, and so he put his German minority population as equal to the Slavs or to the Czechs and the Slavs. In 1934, Thomas Masaryk ran for re-election for the fourth time. In reading it, he was very uncertain whether he should run, because he knew his age was catching up with him, but he wasn't convinced that they would elect the person that he wanted elected, and so he went ahead and ran the fourth time anyway. So on November 21st, he resigned and recommended that Edward Benz be elected as his replacement. And this actually would end up being the last election before World War II. Benz was elected president in 1935. In 1938, Hitler demanded that the Sudeten Germans be given their own land under German rule, not under Czech rule. He further demanded that Poland and Hungary have their border issues favorably settled with Bohemia. So this meant that they were going to have to give up what was on the western side known as Ruthene lands, and a little piece of on the north side, which was still part of the old Silesia area. In September 28th of 1938, Neville Chamberlain and Edward Daladier of France basically sold out Czechoslovakia to Hitler at the Munich conference to try to avoid war with Germany. And as we know, the appeasement did absolutely nothing as far as stopping the war, and it only made it more difficult for the people who were being appeased on. So on October 5th, after this had happened, Benz resigns and goes into exile. I think he realized that he had no real future and that Hitler was basically going to take over and that it was unsafe for him to stay around as the president. On March 15th of 1939, Hitler's army just basically moves in and takes over Czechoslovakia. While the war was going on, Benz formed a government in exiles in Britain. And one of the conditions that he let be known right off the bat was that the German population had to basically be removed from the Sudeten area of the country as part of the war ending and Czechoslovakia resuming as a country. At the end of the war, Moscow really played the most active role in shaping the new government with Ben's direction. The communists, the people, the Soviets, they basically wanted the country to be made up of two equal parts, the Czechs and the Slovaks. And Moscow was definitely okay with the expulsion of all Germans and Hungarians, who obviously had also fought for the Germans. And so Benz arrived back in Prague 2 days after the end of fighting in May of 1945, and he set about to form a government. He, at this time, also nationalized industry. He nationalized the financial institutions, the banks, and he nationalized agriculture. The National Assembly started back up on October 28th, 1945, which was Czech Independence Day. And the first post-war election was held in May 26 of 1946. In that election, the communists received about 40% of the vote, and it made them the single largest voting bloc. And because of that, they seated several key ministers, including the prime minister. So Benz was the president, and the prime minister was a communist. In 1947, Czechoslovakia turned down an opportunity the Kremlin that they were not to participate in the Marshall Plan, that they were going to be part of the Soviet orbit. So in February of 1948, saw the ascendance of communist control of Czechoslovakia, and at that time, Benz resigned and left the government. And he was also in declining health at that time. So we go along from this period and up until 1968 with a pretty much a Stalinist communist government in Czechoslovakia. In 1968, a Slovak by the name of Alexander Dubček was appointed as first secretary, and he decided to introduce a more human face to socialist communism by liberalizing censorship. The Soviets were appalled when they found out what he was trying to do, and they were basically determined that they were going to end this kind of liberalism that was just not going to be allowed. So on the night of August 20th and 21st of 1968, the Soviet army, along with troops from most of the neighboring Warsaw Pact countries, invaded Czechoslovakia and put an end to the Prague Spring. Now, I'm sure most of us probably remember when this happened. In 1989, of course, the Soviet government was falling apart and Soviet domination was crumbling. November 17th of 1989, the police attacked a group of student demonstrators, and this really set motion a lot of things in motion. And on the 19th, there was a human rights activist group formed called Civic Forum. And then on the 20th, 250,000 people came together to demonstrate in Prague. On the 24th of November, the communist government resigned. And then on the 27th, there was a nationwide 2-hour strike to protest the continued presence of communists. On December 3rd, a new election was conducted. However, this was done so fast that communists dominated in this election. They also were the ones that ran the election. And so more demonstrations were kicked off, and this resulted in a redo of the election, this time an actual free election. And this time the communists were in the minority, and Czechoslovakia was headed toward actually having democratic rule with a multi-party government. So the Velvet Revolution was followed by and again, this period of time in 1989 was pretty much, I guess you'd say, conflict free, other than the arrests of the 17 demonstrators on the 17th of November. There really wasn't a lot of bloodshed or anything like that. So it became known as the Velvet Revolution. And it was followed by the Velvet Divorce, where the Czech Republic agreed to separate from Slovakia. In June of 1982, Slovakia held elections to determine whether the people in Slovakia wanted to be independent, and they confirmed that they wanted to be their own country. And so the two parties reached agreement and agreed to separate. The two areas were really quite dissimilar. The Czech part is highly industrialized, fairly, it's heavily populated, whereas the Slovakian part is more rural and doesn't have quite the population densities. So they really are two independent areas. The first freely elected president of Czech Republic was playwright Václav Havel, and the Czech Republic joined NATO in 1999 and joined the EU in 2004. Today, Chekia, and this is the preferred current spelling of the entity that exists as a country, is really a prosperous country with a lot of machinery manufacturing, paper making, glass, steel production, ceramic manufacturing, and the Czechs are noted as brewers of really good beer. So in 2020, the population of the Czech Republic was 10.6 million people. So I've got I think a little bit of a treat to finish off today. It's about a 20-minute presentation. That's the history of the city of Prague. And it's such a kind of a unique city that I think it's worth just looking at its history and its architecture. So we'll go back and hopefully this will work fine. Back.
The heart of Europe, one of the most beautiful and most visited cities in Europe. Its unique historical center is concentrated into a small area. Romanesque churches and Gothic cathedrals intermingle with Renaissance and Baroque palaces, Rococo villas, and Art Nouveau buildings.
The sound is very garbled.
The name Prague ostensibly comes from the Czech word prach, which means threshold or shoal. It may refer to the rocky shoals of the Vltava riverbed or the stone thresholds of old houses. Some say Prague is the threshold of the mystic world. Built on a stone promontory above the Vltava River, Prague Castle is the oldest historically recorded location connected to Christianity.
Vyšehrad was another center of royal power. In the 11th and 12th centuries, this fortified point located across the river was the temporary main residence of Bohemia's rulers. Later, on the same side of the Vltava, a settlement arose around a medieval market. As a city, it was fortified with walls and 13 towers. On the side of one, the so-called worn-out tower, a Gothic structure was.
Looking for the best steels in woodworking and metalworking? Grizzly's got them. Top brands like Grizzly, Milwaukee.
Gothic structure was built, called the Powder Tower because it served to store gunpowder. The coronation procession of Bohemia's kings and queens passed through this monumental gate as they toured the town on their way to St. Vitus Cathedral at Prague Castle. Rich burghers and aristocrats built splendid palaces along the royal way. The buildings along medieval Selitna Street are Gothic in origin, although today visitors admire their splendid Baroque facades. Like the processions of the Bohemian kings, the steps of every visitor lead inevitably to spacious Old Town Square. The 5 buildings which make up the centerpiece Old Town Hall are Gothic in origin. The last and most beautiful of the 5 is Umanuti, featuring a Renaissance sgraffito facade. One of the 20th century's most famous writers, Prague native Franz Kafka, lived here. The 4-sided tower of the town hall, 69.5 meters tall, was built in the 14th century. A remarkable astronomical clock was built onto the front of the tower at the beginning of the 15th century. Every hour, a moving figure of death tolls a bell, and above it, Christ and the apostles file past 2 small windows. Other figures represent human vices. The performance ends with the crowing of a cock. The central part of the clock shows current and medieval time, as well as the motions of the moon and sun. The lower section, the zodiac, as depicted by 19th century painter Josef Manes, turns once per year. Many legends are connected to the astronomical clock. The best known tells of Master Hanush, the builder of the remarkable timepiece. The town councilors ordered him to be blinded with a burning poker so that he would never again construct such an incredible mechanism. A statue of Jan Hus dominates the center of the square. Thanks to Hus, Prague became the first center of the Catholic Reformation. Hus was burned as a heretic by the Council of Constance in 1415. The most majestic edifice on the square is the Gothic Church of Our Lady before Teen. It was a center of Protestantism in the 14th and 15th centuries. Renowned Danish astrologer and astronomer Tycho Brahe is buried here. By the 11th century, the original church was part of a unique complex of medieval foreign trade called the Ungelt. The Renaissance Granovsky Palace is the highlight. The enclosed courtyard housed inns for merchants, a medieval customs house, workshops, warehouses, and stables. The Ungelt became part of UNESCO's World Heritage in the 1960s. The only residence on the Old Town Square with its original Gothic facade is the house at the Stone Bell. According to legend, a bell from the adjacent Teen Church fell on it. It is the most important Gothic tower house east of the Rhine. Some say it was built by the last Premuslide queen, Eliška Přemyslovna. Her son, Emperor Charles IV, stayed here. The Rococo Goltz-Kinsky Palace makes a fine contrast. Historically interesting buildings on the south side of the square include the highly picturesque Storchhaus, decorated with frescoes by Mikuláš Aleš, depicting alchemist workshops and St. Wenceslas. There are Gothic fragments here as well. Frescoes by Aleš adorn Rothaus as well, located on neighboring Small Square. The pearl of Prague Baroque architecture, the Church of St. Nicholas, stands on the same side of Old Town Square. Beyond the church lies the site of the former Jewish ghetto. At the beginning of the 20th century, the area was transformed when the old Jewish quarter was completely redeveloped. Unfortunately, all that remains of the old Jewish quarter, called Yosefov, are 6 synagogues, the town hall, and the old Jewish cemetery. Approximately 20,000 gravestones can be found in the 15th century cemetery, but roughly 100,000 people are buried here. To compensate for the lack of space, some areas of the cemetery have graves arranged in layers, one on top of another.
Break out the table runners and invite your friends. Ashley is giving Easter a spruce up. Dish out gorgeous.
Famed Rabbi Lowe is interred in a Baroque tomb. He was the creator of the golem, that superhuman creature made of clay. According to legend, Golem is hidden in the attic of the Old New Synagogue. Dating from the 13th century, it is the oldest synagogue in Prague. If we return to the Old Royal Way, we pass along the bustling and romantic Karlova Street, bordered in part by a huge center of Jesuit Catholic learning, the Clementinum. The most important ruler of the crowned lands of Bohemia, Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, passed by these sites as well. In the second half of the 14th century, he spanned the Vltava River with a stone bridge grander than any other in Central Europe. The emperor assigned the task of building the bridge to Peter Parler, the brilliant architect of St. Vitus Cathedral. A tower marks each end of the bridge. In the Middle Ages, the towers served as defenses and for toll collection. Located on the right bank of the Vltava, the Old Town Tower is considered the most beautiful Gothic tower in Central Europe. The shorter tower on the lesser town side is Romanesque and dates from the 12th century. It is a remnant of the original stone Judith Bridge. It has been joined by a 15th century tower. The sculptural decoration on the Charles Bridge is Baroque. All the statues depict saints. Each statue has its own story, and some of them bring luck. One of the oldest is the bronze statue of Saint John Nepomuk from the workshop of Jan Brokoff. According to legend, Wenceslaus IV had him murdered in a rage because Nepomuk refused to divulge the secrets of the Queen's confessional. Actually, it concerned a conflict between the sovereign and the church. Just off the Charles Bridge is the quiet area called Kampa, with its many picturesque nooks and corners. After passing through wide Mostetska Street, the royal procession arrived at Lesser Town Square, the center of Prague's lesser town. The square is divided into two parts by one of Prague's architectural centerpieces, St. Nicholas Church, with its massive green dome and slender tower. Designed by Krzysztof and Kilian Ignaz Dietzenhofer, this impressive structure is considered Bohemia's most beautiful Baroque work. Its magnificent architecture is in harmony with the exquisite interior. The frescoes in the dome, for example, feature the celebration of the Holy Trinity. Prague isn't famous merely for its architecture and fine arts. For centuries, it has attracted the foremost personalities of European culture. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart even played the church organ here. While in Prague, he composed his best-known opera, Don Giovanni, and dedicated it to my Praguers. Prague will celebrate the 250th anniversary of his birth in 2006 with a grand citywide Mozart festival. Steep and picturesque, Nerudova Street was the final stretch traveled by the royal entourage. In the Middle Ages, various poetic house markers were used instead of street numbers. Finally, the king's retinue arrived at their goal, Prague Castle, the seat of princes, kings, and presidents. The founding of Prague Castle is closely linked to Christianity. The rotunda of St. Vitus dates from this period and is the first sacred structure with a round floor plan. It was built by the patron of Bohemia, St. Wenceslaus. A chapel housing his remains is the jewel of the interior of the Cathedral of Saints Vitus, Adalbert, and Wenceslaus. It was built by Charles IV in the 14th century. Frescoes painted around the lower chapel walls are adorned with semi-precious Bohemian stones set in gilded plaster. The upper walls are decorated with frescoes drawn from the life of Saint Wenceslaus. A side door, secured with 7 locks, opens onto a stairway leading to a chamber where the crown jewels are kept. St. Wenceslaus' crown is made of over 4 pounds of pure gold and is decorated with 96 gems and pearls. Of the 9 biggest sapphires in the world, the Bohemian crown has 6. Its ruby is the biggest gem in the world used as jewelry. Premyslide princes and kings, interred in the cathedral's chapels, ruled Prague from Prague Castle until 1306. In the 14th century, Charles IV, King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor, made Prague the political and cultural center of the empire. For several decades, Prague was the capital of all Christian Europe. St. Vitus Cathedral is the most significant church structure in the Czech Republic. 600 years passed between the laying of the cornerstone and putting on the finishing touches. The church has outstanding artistic decoration. An incomparable medieval mosaic radiates above bold Gothic arches, the Last Supper fashioned of Bohemian glass.
You're only a touch away from making delicious, healthy juices at home with minimal effort.
A monumental external support system allows for the lofty nobility of the nave, which is decorated with lacy pinnacles and gargoyles. The most magnificent secular Gothic building in Prague is Vladislav Hall in the old royal palace. The hall was used on special occasions, such as feasts for coronations and weddings. From here we move on to St. George Square, home to the All Saints Church and the Romanesque Basilica of St. George and the Teresian Female Institute. Picturesque Golden Lane is tucked in behind St. George's Basilica. In the tiny houses, literally cemented to the fortifications, lived marksmen of the castle guard. Legend claims that alchemists tried to make gold here for that eccentric scholar and world art collector, Rudolf II. In blue-painted number 22, Franz Kafka wrote some of his works. At the beginning of the 20th century, Golden Lane was a deserted spot where Nobel Prize winner Jaroslav Seifert found himself a pleasant place to write. Poor people and servants once lived near the castle in a quaint quarter called New World. Rudolf II's world-renowned astronomer, Tycho Brahe, lived here, at the house at the Golden Leg. Choral singers from the nearby Loretta Church once lived in New World as well. Loretta, a 17th century Marian pilgrimage site, is one of Prague's most lovely Baroque structures. It is interesting for its marvelous sculptural decoration and for the Marian melody which chimes every hour. A street named after the church leads to vast Hradčany Square, which is dominated by grand aristocratic palaces. A plague column dedicated to the Virgin rises in the center of the square. It was created by Ferdinand Maximilian Brockhoff, one of Bohemia's foremost Baroque sculptors. After following the long and opulent way of the kings, we can rest in one of Prague Castle's lovely gardens. On the northern side of the castle complex, the gorgeous royal gardens extend toward the Renaissance Belvedere Palace, or as it is called, Queen Anne's Summer House. The most extensive gardens are at Wallenstein Palace. They are decorated with replicas of sculptures by Adrian de Vries and a man-made stalactite grotto. An outstanding view of the Mannerist Church of Our Lady Victorious opens up before visitors to the opulent Baroque Wörthba Gardens. The church is home to the famous Baby Jesus, or Bambino di Praga as it is better known. This wax sculpture is famed throughout the Catholic world for its ability to perform miracles. People from all over the globe have given the Bambino colorful outfits richly decorated with pearls, gold, and diamonds. Admittedly, the time of princes, kings, and emperors is long past, but tired visitors to this magical city may relax in countless cafes and pubs and refresh themselves with a cool draft. Many pubs have been in business for centuries and entice patrons with a wide variety of specialties. Renowned brewpub U Fleku, for example, makes an outstanding dark beer. Anyone with the energy to continue on into the night may take advantage of a wide range of bars and other night spots on Wenceslas Square. Prague, 100-towered, golden, magical, the heart of Europe. Every day the sun shines down on narrow streets and palaces as the town comes once again to life, today, just as it did centuries ago. The history of one of Europe's most beautiful cities slowly continues on.
Okay, well, that's all I have for today. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Yeah, Jim, this is Betty, and at the Catholic Church, St. Mary's in Marietta, we have a beautiful statue of the infant Jesus of Prague. And when I was going to St. Mary's Elementary School, they always changed the outfits
Yeah.
according to what season we were in. And it's now in our children's little section in our church, but it was so much fun growing up and seeing that beautiful statue in our church.
Yeah.
But
Well,
now I know where it came from. That's so interesting.
Prague is just really it's an enchanting looking city. I'd love to visit there sometime. But
I would too. That's beautiful. Thank you.
My daughter went there. She, Nicole Coyle, she
Yeah.
graduated from Wake Forest, and they had this trip available for any student who wanted to go. So they went to about 7 or 8 countries. And she said when she went to Prague, it was like being in a fairy tale because the buildings were so beautiful. But she saw a lot of American college students there, and she felt very much at home.
Wow.
Jim, this is Art. How heavily do you think King Wencesla's crown was guarded?
I suspect it's just heavily guarded.
As they described the precious metals and the stones, I wonder how many guards are around there.
Yeah. Well, I've seen the crown jewels in London, and you know, they're really heavily guarded, and I'm sure these are just as heavily guarded. You talk about the biggest sapphires and rubies and whatnot. It's a pretty impressive crown.
Another interesting thing about the Republic is they've produced quite a few outstanding tennis players.
Yes.
Jim, this is Steve Meyer. I have a question.
Yes.
I know this beyond the scope of this course, but are you familiar at all with the Peasants' War of Germany in about the mid-1800s?
I think I've read about that. There were peasant uprisings all over Europe. So what happened in that one?
Well, I believe the noblemen put them down.
Okay. Because I know, you know, like I was talking about the one where they had the uprising in Lithuania, and the peasants, they killed off a big group of nobles, and that was in the, I believe that was in the late 1600s.
I'm descended partly from 4 brothers that came over from Germany about the mid 1800s, and the family lore is that they came over here to avoid war. Who knows?
Well, I was talking to Betty earlier. I read a book on the history of North Dakota, and there's a group of people in the southwestern North Dakota that immigrated from the Ukraine, and they're German heritage people. And the reason they left the Ukraine was because they were enticed to the Ukraine by Catherine the Great, and then one of her descendants decided that they would have universal military conscription in Russia, and they left to escape being in the army, and they went to North Dakota.
Something that's always struck me as very unusual was the splitting of Czechoslovakia into 2 countries, which was totally voluntary, and the Czechs accepted that the Slovaks wanted to go. It doesn't seem to be very common. If you look in the United States, the South wanted to go, so we fought the Civil War. Right now, the Russians are fighting a war to keep the Ukrainians from separating from the Soviet sphere. I mean, how do you explain the fact that in Prague, they just said, all right, you want to go? Is that because Václav Havel was such a civilized leader compared to, say, Putin or even Lincoln? I don't know. Lincoln would, we're going to go to war to keep the country together. What caused them to be able to do that?
Well, I think that I really think there's a fair amount of cultural difference between the 2 areas, and they just, you know, as people, they just didn't seem to have a huge amount in common with each other. And I think the other thing is a lot of that area of Slovakia had kind of been divided over, over centuries. Little pieces of it had been parceled off to different empires and whatnot. So it probably doesn't have the attachment to the Czech part that a lot of other places do.
Well,
What about the language? Do they speak the same language in Czechos in the two countries, or are they
I believe
two
they
languages?
do. Ernie, can you address that?
I do not think that they are the same language, but I'm not sure. But what I was going to comment on was that if you look at Yugoslavia, it was the industrialized wealthier sections of Yugoslavia which wanted to leave Yugoslavia. First Slovenia, then Croatia. But in the Czechoslovakia, it was the poorer, the less industrialized section, Slovakia, which wanted to leave the Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
And some say that, I heard it said that it was the old communist bosses of Slovakia who wanted to maintain power. That's why they left. But I don't know that's true or not. That's just what I heard in Slovakia.
There probably some truth to that.
I'm curious about Moravia. It's kind of right between Czech and Slovakia. So where did it go?
Well, it's part of the Czech Republic.
Okay.
The area to the east of Moravia is Slovakia.
Right. So Moravia is just like a district or
a county.
Region. Okay. All right. That answered my question.
I think there's I don't remember the exact number. I've seen the map, but there's like 9 or 11 counties in the Czech Republic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it says here
I looked up the difference in languages, and this is in a geography handbook. And the official language in Slovakia is Slovak, but Hungarian is quite a bit a part of it. And then for the Czech Republic, it says Czech is the primary language and Slovak is secondary.
Okay.
So they sound very similar.
It says here in Wikipedia, says Slovak is closely related to Czech to the point of mutual intelligibility to a very high degree. It's also related to Polish. Whereas Hungarian is a totally different language. It's not hardly related to much of anything. So,
yeah, it's a Magyar language.
Related distantly to Finnish, I believe.
Yeah.
So you said there were like 7 or more counties in the Czech Republic.
Yes.
Are they called? Is that what they call an oblast? And I might not be pronouncing that correctly.
Well, that's in Russia. Oblast is a kind of a region, but I'm not sure. I think it's bigger than a county, is my impression. It would be like the Ural Oblast, which would be quite a large area, kind of like the Midwest.
Yeah.
Okay. I was curious because I'm an Airbnb host, and there's a way to help hosts in Ukraine by booking their accommodation and paying for it, but not traveling. So they get the money without you going there. And when you search for places, a lot of times it comes up like Kiev Oblast or Lviv Oblast.
Yeah, and that's the area surrounding, it's the city and the surrounding communities.
How do you spell that? Oblast?
Oblast. O-B.
L-A-S-T, just like.
Yeah, O-B-L-A-S-T.
Thank you. Oblast.
Yeah, if you're interested in this book by Hugh Agnew, The Czechs in the Land of the Bohemian Crown, it's a good read. It's like I said, it's well, you know, it's well put together and it's well referenced. So you know, if you're interested more about this particular part of the world, I would recommend taking the time to read it. Well, if no one has anything else, I wish you all a wonderful weekend, and I'm going to get outside and enjoy the fresh air with my dog.
It's too windy out there. I was outside. It's so windy. I had to come in anyways.
Okay.
Not that it looks nicer looking through the window than it does when you get out.
It is being out there.
Thank you, Jim.